All right, welcome back. In the last session, we got started with subscription. We saw a bunch of resources, we saw a bunch of settings underneath the subscription. We saw how we could just use subscription features and what it holds for us in the upcoming session, why subscription is important. There's another concept which is really fundamental when it's come to element managing any resources onto Azure. You're gonna hear a lot from the tech folks or the DevOps that resource group, we've created this resource group, this resource is under this particular resource group. So in this session we're going to talk about resource group and resource manager. So what is a resource group? It's the fundamental element of Azure platform. It's a logical container for resources deployed on Azure for multiple or one resource. What does that mean? You as a developer, or if you're a business analyst, product manager, you want to see where are your application deployed, where are the VMs, where are the Kubernetes cluster running onto your Azure subscription. You're not going to go ahead directly into the subscription and just find it. They would always reside under a resource group. A resource can only be a member of a single resource group, and they can always travel from one resource group to another, which means it's a logical partition. Just like subscription, it's another partition wherein you group your resources together. Now these resources could be your virtual machine, storage, volumes, IP address, network interface. You assign them to a single resource group so that it is easier to apply access control, monitor them, and track cost related activities when it comes to managing the workload. Now you would say, okay, that is fine, the definition is fine, but as a business analyst or a product owner or a non-tech user, if you have subscription, why do you need a resource group? Well, we need a resource group because let's suppose you're working in an engineering team. Now engineering team would have a multiple sub teams underneath it, right? One could be a platform team, a product team, a finance team, or marketing, or could be any of them, right? The back end, sales, DevOps, all of the team would reside under engineering team, right? So in order to have segregate them team under team, you would need a resource group. So if you need to have, it's a mandatory, it's not optional. In order to create any resources like you see database, storage, or a virtual machine, in order to create them, you need to put them under a resource group. You cannot straight away go ahead and create resources underneath the subscription. You need to have a resource group in order to store these resources. Now just consider this. The analogy could be, if you have a project manager, why do you need multiple tech leads or multiple team leaders for different teams? Because project manager just can't manage all of the teams together, right? He can take updates from different tech leads or team leads. However, for each smaller set of team, you need to have some sort of somebody who is governing them. Now a team of 5 members, consider these 5 members are 5 different resources: a virtual machine, a storage, a resource, could be anything, and to manage them you need a tech lead. I hope this analogy is making sense. Now probably take a look at how do you create resource group. In order to create a resource group, you could just use GUI, just like we did in the last session, or you could use the command line. Now if you're not fond of GUI, the portal which we used, you could use the command line interface also, and you could have any preference. It doesn't matter from which background you are. As a tech or a non-tech person, you could use portal. The ideal scenario you could be, if you're new to cloud, you could use the portal, and then slowly when you have gotten a knack of it, you understand what our resources and resource groups are, then probably you can use the command line interface and then henceforth move forward. Now the good part is, whether you access from Azure, from Azure portal or command line or any of the other tools, or PowerShell, which is a native command line interface or scripting platform for from Microsoft, underlying resource which all of these going to interact would remain same, which is Azure Resource Manager. So let's suppose you have created a virtual machine using Azure portal. Next time, if you are querying the same virtual machine, if you're trying to create the same virtual machine from the command line, it is going to contact the resource manager API, because now this guy over here has all the information about what has been created by whom. If it sees that it is already created, it's going to tell you that, okay, this was already created. You might just want to check whether, if you're sure about creating it or not. So it's a consistent API, consistent management layer, where you can see that every activity you do hits the Azure Resource Manager, and Resource Manager then contacts the underlying REST providers for different providers. Could be for virtual machine, web apps, database, and whatnot. I hope this is making sense. Now, the uh, biggest question which comes into the picture is, as a tech or non-tech user, doesn't matter, how many resource groups should you have? Now, example of this could be, as you can see, you could have one resource group, and underneath one resource group, you could have multiple resources. Could be your front-end VM, back-end VM, virtual network storage. But why do you want to keep them under the same resource group? Because they're kind of interdependent on each other. They have the same life cycle. As long as the front end exists, it needs to have a back end also with the same connected to it. As long as they both exist, you need to have a storage account, because to keep the data and logging files and all of that. In order to communicate with each other, you need to have some sort of virtual network, and they need to exist in a certain group. Now, if you want to eradicate or delete all of them at once, you could just, on a single click, you could just click delete the resource group, and all the underneath resources would be deleted. Now, if they are not dependent on each other, what you could do is you could just create different resource group for them. Over here, we're creating different resource group: one for RG, one for storage, 2, 3 for front end and back end, and then virtual network also, because they are not dependent on each other per se. They can act on individually, and they don't need each other's support. Um, all right, I hope this makes sense when it comes to creating resource group. The thumb rule which I generally follow in my project is, the resources which are kind of interdependent, or to make things less convoluted for a single team or a single project, I would just create one resource group, and all the similar type of resources kind of goes club into together. Now, just think about if you're working on a data project and you're working on a platform project also. So data things, all of them, you kind of put them together in a single resource group, and rest of the other backend APIs and all of that, you can put in a different resource group. Few of the tips which you could follow once you're creating a resource group or understanding resource group. Your location, once you're creating a resource group, you need to select the location also, because that's where metadata about the resources is saved. You should understand the limitation of resource group. I guess you could create as many as 800 resource group per subscription, but that keeps on changing. So please have a look at it once you're trying to create many resource groups. You could use PowerShell also in order to you check the virtual machine or the storage usage, how you could just, before managing them. We're going to take a look at it, how you could do it. Now, tagging is one such feature which is consistent across all the elements into Azure. We saw we could just create tags into subscription also, and you could see that you could create a tag onto your resource group as well. All right, you could have as many as 15 tag each resource group or resources. Now, typical example could be what type of resource group it is, whether it's a dev, test, production, what type of role it has got, web, cache, or DB, which department it is, finance, legal, platform, and all of that. Who is responsible, intra team, or development team, or a QA team. In order to make things consistent, a key value pair is identified as a tag, which can be specifically used when you are trying to pull down all the resources as at the end of the year, when you want to see how many resources you have created, or you want to see the billing details also. So based on these tags, you could just see the billings, how much cost your virtual machine has costed you, how much cost this particular resource group has costed you. So if you have tags basis on cost center or department, you could just pull them out together. We're going to see in our upcoming session how we could just utilize them. So all of them kind of is managed by something called as resource manager. Resource manager is where all of the resource group is actually being managed. We saw in the diagram, right? It lets us manage and control the resources within it, and all the access to those resources underneath the resource group are managed using the uh, role-based access control. You could see the audit logs also. You could either visualize it using the UI, or you could use the PowerShell also. As an administrator, you would want to also log these resource groups. So this is one of the coolest feature which I find in resource group. You could put a log on top of your resource group so that nobody can accidentally delete the resource group, which might just happen in a big organization. So I hope this was informative. Now, in order to see the hierarchy, we started with the subscription in the last session. We then came to resource group. So subscription belonged to one active directory, and each subscription could contain multiple resource group. Each resource group would have multiple resources, and that's the hierarchy, or the brain diagram which you want to see. All of these are maintained using Azure Resource Manager. So not only you could create stuff resource group using the UI or CLI, you could use the resource group manager also, that called as ARM template in Azure. So if you, that's the by default native feature given by Azure to deploy your resources. It's called as ARM template. I repeat it again, Azure Resource Manager template, which lets you templatize or bootstrap your environment application resources in the cloud. So if you don't want to manage anything using the GUI, and you want to have some sort of uniformity to maintain all of these resources, you could use these templates. We're going to have a look at it also, how these templates can be prepared. The biggest benefit which I see is they are declarative, because they are created in using JSON, which is pretty easy to read, so that you could use the same template over and again to create bunch of resources. So this is the by default tool which Azure gives us to create the resources. You want to take a look at the example. So either you could create using the UI, which already we've seen. Either you could create using the imperative way or the declarative way. Declarative way is this one, and the imperative way is once you want to create some resources using PowerShell. That's it. I hope this was informative. I will see you in a demo wherein we're going to create our resource group and understand how it works. I'll see you in a while. Thank you.